Good evening, everyone. My name is Manisha Thomas. I'm with the Women's Refugee Commission in Geneva. We're actually based in New York, but I'm the Geneva rep. I think I'm too short. Is that better? Sorry. I'm a short person, so I don't always get the right height. So welcome, everyone, and also welcome to those who are online with us. We are live streaming this event on Nobody Helped Me, Gender-Based Violence and Forced Migration from Displacement to Refuge. And it is a real honor to be here because it is the launch of the research report and the research that has been done over 4 years of the SEREDA Project, which has been led by the University of Birmingham, University of Melbourne, Bilkent, and Uppsala, as well as NGO partners, including the Women's Refugee Commission. So it's been a real honor to be part of the project, as well as be here for this official launch. We're going to have a few welcomes, and then we are going to have an overview of the research before we have a panel discussion. And we will be also inviting you in the audience or online to ask questions of our panelists. I will introduce everyone as we go along. Just a few housekeeping rules or housekeeping notes before I pass over for the welcome. If you do want to stay in touch after the event in terms of finding out more things about the SEREDA project, or you want to stay in touch with IFRC, the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or if you want to be in touch from the museum as well, there are 3 sign-up sheets over on the table back there that you can leave your contacts on. They are 3 separate sheets just because of data protection rules. However, if you don't want to write your name out 3 times, please just indicate plus the other 2 beside it in which ones you'd like, and we can then make sure that those get to the appropriate people. If you'd like to tweet about the event or share on social media, there is Wi-Fi available. It's the MICR_public, no password. We will have a reception at the end, and I'll explain where that is, but that will give you an opportunity to also see some of the artwork reflecting the research, which Jenny will be telling us about later. And with that, I am going to first pass over to Pascal Hufschmid, who is the director of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum. He's an art historian specializing in photography and believes that art and museums also provide a better understanding of current events. He brings a lot of international experience in the museum sector, the art market, and international organizations, and has developed large-scale multidisciplinary cultural projects with both public and private partners. He's worked at the Musée de Lycée, and in Lausanne, he contributed to the creation of a new arts district, Platform 10, and launched the Élysée Prize in International Support Award for Photography. I am going to pass over to you, Pascal, for a few welcome words before I then introduce our next speakers. Pascal, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody here at the museum and online. It's a great pleasure for my colleagues and myself to welcome you in this institution, and as an open and welcoming forum for debate on creativity, on the history, the principles, and the ongoing challenges of humanitarian action. And we do this in many, many ways through all of our projects, our content, but we've also tried over the past year to focus on big societal themes that connect different communities which are here together this evening, I believe. One community is humanitarian workers and the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, of course. Another is researchers, artists, cultural players in Switzerland and all around the world. And the third community is, of course, our audience online and here at the museum, all of our visitors. And it's fascinating for us to take time and to embrace societal questions that connect these communities. One of them is gender and diversity. Gender and diversity is at the heart of so many questions and issues in the humanitarian sector, for research, within culture, and in our everyday lives. And this is why it's very meaningful to us to talk about it publicly, curate content, publish books, exhibitions on this subject, but also question ourselves as employers and as a company as to how we can improve our standards and really walk the talk. So this evening for us, it's also a way to shed a different light on this question and to clearly embrace complexity and to do it in a very open and inclusive way. So I hope everybody here and online will feel free to ask questions and that we can start a very inspiring conversation and a useful one. So thank you very much, and I pass on to Frank.
Thank you very much, Pascal. And I am going to now introduce Frank Moorhauer, who is the director of the National Society Policy and Development at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So Frank is also going to welcome us, as IFRC has been a long-standing partner of the SEREDA Project as well. Prior to his current appointment, Frank was the Director of Governance and Board Support Department at IFRC and was responsible for matters related to the governance of IFRC and was also Secretary to the Governing Board, the General Assembly, and other statutory meetings. And he's also led processes to revise the Constitution and rules of procedure at IFRC, and he's worked on innovative governance structures. He's a lawyer and a judge from the University of Cologne in Germany and in Lausanne, Switzerland. With that, Frank, I'm going to pass it over to you for the second part of our welcome piece.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pascal, for the invitation and giving this opportunity. As you heard from my short CV, that is a very different role what I'm doing now here, having this department what I was previously doing. And my special thanks go out to you, Pascal, because last time we were working together, it was my old former role. We just had a bit of an exchange in terms of the international conference. And I'm very glad that I've changed from a more structural job into a more substantive job and to continue the relationship with you. And I think we've been, as you already outlined, had several interactions with the museum on these big societal questions, gender, on inclusion, on volunteering, etc. And I hope we can continue with this. And it's a very big and great privilege also now to work with the SEREDA project in the museum together, because I think this is extremely timely. We all see currently, it came all to our TV screens for the last 2 months, the sexual gender-based violence, but it's longer than the Ukrainian crisis. It's something which is happening in the world, unfortunately, all over the place, and it just now very strongly comes into the European media as well, a couple of days ago in Congo, in both Congos, and where it is ongoing since many years. So I think this research you have been doing and having this event is extremely timely to really lift up the discussion which is around all the non-discussion which we're having at the moment, to lift this up. And the title, and I was struck by the title. As I said, I'm not the big expert in this theme, but when I read the title, nobody helped me. This is a shock for a humanitarian. This title, this quote. And I must say that led me to read everything and to get really into this. Because why? I felt like, is this just a state of fact? Just nobody helped me. Is this an accusation? Or is this a call to action? And me, as being humanitarian for many years, even if I was the secretary of the governing board, that is for me a call to action. And I think this report will set the basics for this call to action. I think we need, as humanitarians, wake up and do something. And here we have now finally the research evidence that what we are having here is no longer acceptable, and we need to move forward and we need to do something. And so this is why I think this research is so important, and this collaboration that institutions, humanitarian institutions like the IFRC, are working together with these academic institutions, because we are in a world where facts are not always considered as being most important, but I think we have to base ourselves on facts. And the facts which we are seeing here are devastating. Just a couple of highlights which struck me when reading this. the amount of specifically women seeing sexual and gender-based violence during their migratory route, 70%. That is incredible. It's not something that, oh, you had bad luck. It is something that seems to be rather you were lucky. The majority apparently seem to go through this. That's just something which we are not talking about. The evidence shows that this is really a major impact. What I also thought was shocking to see that if you say, okay, if you are going through the Sahara unaccompanied in dangerous territories, there's a certain risk. But the study shows us also very clearly it doesn't stop and end in the so-called safe havens of European countries or North America, wherever migrants are. That is also actually it's not only about working with the national society, but also those where the study is reinforcing our work we're doing as a movement for several years already. We specifically, our national societies are focusing on this. That is another for us to really engage to be so transparent, open, facts on the table, because we have now something. And make this, as I said, question about nobody else off to action that we really are staying true to our commitments of that we do not need anybody behind. Put these things on the table, we discuss. I hope it's not only staying in the discussion, but to really move forward. And I'm very happy also to a little of a thanks to my own team who has put this together. There's Lisa, Amjad, and the rest of the team who have done a fantastic job. And I hope that they will continuously working with you from the SEREDA Project, but also Pascal. Thanks very much, and great discussions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I think that's a really important point for us to be remembering, that it really is a call to action, that all this research that has been done over 4 years has shown that we are failing women and girls and others throughout their journeys. So we are going to hear about the research that's been done, and it's been an extensive project. For over 4 years, it's had extensive research trying to understand the nature and incidence of gender-based violence experienced by forced migrants who have fled conflict and are residing in countries of refuge. And as the title of the research shows, it's very much that the sexual and gender-based violence that against refugees, from displacement to asylum. So it's really about making sure that we're understanding the full journey. And so it is my pleasure to introduce you to Jenny Fillmore, who is a professor in migration and super diversity at the University of Birmingham. She's been researching with refugees for over 20 years and is the project lead of SEREDA. So for you, Jenny, I imagine, and also the other researchers involved, having this launch is really kind of the epitome of all that work coming out and really being to identify the findings and the lessons. And I think the next steps of where we go based on all that research will really be what we do with all those findings, and how we can improve humanitarian responses will be critical. Jenny's also co-wrote the UK government's Refugee Indicators of Integration and has advised governments globally. So she's got a great deal of experience, and she will be telling us about the findings of the research project. Jenny, please.
Thanks, Manisha, and thanks for everybody coming here today. I particularly want to thank the museum, who have just been incredibly supportive of SEREDA, given us the space to do this, but have been really helped us put the project together, and to thank IFRC, and also to make the point that SEREDA is many, many more people than you see here today, many more people. We have teams in 4 different countries. We have multiple PhD students, one of whom, Sean Thomas, is at the back of the room today, who's been involved in the project. So it's much more than just about us. And this is a really important moment for the SEREDA project, because we're sharing our international findings, but actually the research is continuing. So we've got another 4 years that we're going to be doing research in this space, and filling some of the gaps that we ourselves have identified. Are one of the key priorities over the next 4 years is to make a difference, really build on the evidence we have, put it in the right places, and to advocate for change. And it's really great, like a call to action, because that's exactly what it is. Okay, I'm also told that I need to warn you that there is some sensitive content in our presentation. We are using the words of survivors. We interchange the word victim and survivor, both apply, and in some of the creative materials that you'll see later. Okay, so where did SEREDA come from? 2015, I was at a migration conference in Brussels, in those joyful days when we were still a member of the European Union. And some NGOs were talking about where the gaps were. And this was an event put together really in response to Europe coming to grips with the incoming migration from Syria and beyond, and the realization that what had happened previously weren't just the odd incident, the odd emergency, that this was becoming a normal part of life across the world. It was becoming normalized. And at that event, some NGOs stood up, I think it was I can't remember the name of the NGO, and said, across this journey, these are the things that are happening, and described sexual and gender-based violence, and said, and nobody knows about it. And this is happening to more than half of the women. There are no services, no one's collecting any data, and it kind of stuck with me. So when Europe and Global Challenges put out a call for something that was Global Challenge, I formed a team with people from the various countries, everyone really committed to working in this space, and we were lucky enough to get funding. That's been followed subsequently by philanthropic funding, which has come through alumni at the University of Birmingham. And we've been sort of quite agile. So new issues arise, we try to identify little pots of funding. Sometimes maybe it's a donation, maybe it's a small pot of policy-related funding. So that's how SEREDA's evolved. But there was initially a really big investment from Europe and Global Challenges, which was foundation funding. It's Volkswagen, it was Wellcome Trust, and Riksbank and Jubilee Fund. Anyway, so that's where SEREDA came from, that moment. We're in a situation now where UNHCR tell us that in 2020, there were 82 million forced migrants. And this has doubled in the last decade. It's an upward trajectory. And of course, we only have to look at our TV screens now to see that it continues. It is, unfortunately, a normal feature of the way the world works. And then at the same time, you've got feminization and intersectionality of these flows. Nearly half of all forced migrants are female. Millions of girls, women, LGBTQI, boys, and some men are vulnerable to SGBV. This is something that affects millions of forced migrants every year. And of course, the Ukraine situation really reinforces that. Our definition of SGBV is not something I plan to discuss in great depth tonight. We have a working paper on that. You can, anytime you want, Google SEREDA Birmingham. We have produced loads of working papers on different aspects of SGBV, and we're now publishing articles as well. But our definition is pretty multifaceted. It includes interpersonal and structural violence. So it's a very broad definition. Why did we go with the 4 different countries we started with, and then Sandra brought Tunisia into the project as well? We tried to look at countries, Sweden, Turkey, Australia and the UK, which were at different parts of the refugee journey and had different responses to, to forced migration. So in some cases, there were countries of mainly resettlement, some instances where it was, like large numbers of asylum seekers, and then of course Turkey, which is a mixture of all kinds of things on a scale at the point at which we started, which massively outweighed the, So that's where we came from. What are our methods? Well, we have used qualitative research. This is very, very delicate information. It's not something that you can put into a questionnaire. So we used an in-depth interview approach. We employed researchers who were multilingual, and we worked, and this is really important, we worked with a lot of NGOs, obviously Women's Refugee Commission in the UK, Doctors of the World, we worked with Foundation House in Australia, and lots of wonderful grassroots organisations who, and we were able to employ their trusted interpreters that women knew and felt their information would be safe with. That's a really key part of this. If I, as a white middle-class woman, had been out there trying to interview people with a male interpreter, we wouldn't have the detail that we have in this the SEREDA project. So that was a really important part of it. We've interviewed 166 survivors. In fact, we've interviewed more than 200 now. We have another 2 SEREDA projects ongoing, and 107 stakeholders. These are people who work with survivors in multiple roles. So it could be in health, it could be in NGOs, it could be international humanitarian organisations. Summarised the sample here, and I'm not going to go into detail. You can look at this in the report. What it is important for you to know is that we work very closely with these NGOs to identify respondents, and then we use something called snowballing, because you don't want to just talk to people who go to NGOs because they're the ones who are accessing services. So we asked them if they knew of other people we could speak to, and over time, trust built up and we were able to access more respondents. This is a huge issue ethically. So we had, we put months into putting an ethical protocol together, and, in that protocol, we had to think about the safety of survivors, because we do not want to re-traumatize people. You cannot guarantee not being able to do that, but we need to put mechanisms in place. And we had to think about the safety of our researchers. This is not something that you want to listen to day in, day out. And generally the people who work in this field are very empathetic, and that can, of course, end up with people feeling not so great from interviews. So we used interview in the survivor's choice of language as well. So we talk about a continuum of SGBV. What we uncovered in the SEREDA project is not that people experience a single incident that makes them flee, or something terrible happens on the journey. They actually experience multiple incidents over time and place. And for some of our respondents, time and place means decades, and it means 5, 6, 7, 8 countries. And these are not, we did not choose our respondents because they were extraordinary. We chose them because they can tell us what these experiences are like. And what we've done to try, so if you go into the detail of these interviews, we didn't ask them to tell us the detail of their SGBV experiences, but often they did, they shared. It was a safe space and they wanted to talk about what had happened to them. But it's very difficult for us to use some of the words that have come out of those interviews because they really are quite horrific. So what we've tried to do is to find a way to represent the complexity. And I think, Frank, you mentioned complexity. Complexity is at the heart of this, and maybe that underpins why nothing's happening. We wanted to be able to reflect the complexity of those experiences in a way that didn't switch off those people who we want to know about these incidences, actually the general public, because we feel that it should be known what is happening out there. We don't want to switch people off. So we tried to find a way to represent the continuum. And this is what you'll be seeing later. I just want to explain to you how this works. So the continuum of violence is basically looking at experiences of SGBV from pre-conflict all the way through to a point where someone thinks they're in refuge. And what we have here in this diagram is a graphic, and it's done by this amazing graphic cartoonist. She's a social values-based cartoonist. Her name is Pen Mendonca, and she has spent so many hours, well, weeks working on this. She's an SGBV survivor herself, and she puts so much into it. And she's come up with this representation. So the bit in the middle here is what happens, the kind of what happens in the country of origin. This is maybe the thing that makes you flee. This is the decision, that moment. It can be, it can be overnight. As you know, you've seen what's happened in Ukraine. Something can happen really quickly. And then round the outside, you have all the countries, and you have in the words of the individual who's recorded here. This one's from Eritrea. You see the words of that person that Pen has painstakingly pulled out of the transcripts we've shared with her. And then at the top, you get the experience. We wanted to highlight the experience once people are in refuge. So this woman talks about being treated like an animal. One of the big things, how do you prove these things? Constantly people saying, I was told to prove that I was gay. I was told to prove that I've been raped. There is no actual way of demonstrating what's happened to you. This man asked me 500 questions. I don't trust the interpreter. They laugh, I cry. So we've got a number of these representations that we want you to look at tonight, when we show you, when we're sharing the cocktail. These represent the kind of complexity that we are seeing. So I'm not going to go into a vast amount of detail here. As I warned you, we are using the words of survivors. So violence in conflict, obviously torture, sexual torture, men forced to watch family and strangers raped. Men would tell us, I have experienced SGBV. I had to watch this. It was so horrific. Forced marriage, forced conscription. Moving along, then violence in flight, camps, extremely dangerous places, young men particularly talking about how they were difficult, LGBTQIA, women and children talking about no safe spaces in camps, physical violence, SGBV by authorities, local people, employers. I mean, it seems like women moving across different countries, across borders, are identified by predators as being really vulnerable. And there are many kinds of predators. Transactional sex, rape by traffickers and smugglers. It's extraordinary the number of women who had reached Libya who ended up enslaved and escaped, and then were caught again and were enslaved again. So there's kind of kidnapping, enslavement going on as well. Once in refuge, we go into quite a lot of detail in our report about what happens in refuge, because I think, if there's anything we control in Europe, Australia, and Turkey, we can control what happens in our own country. Maybe we can't prevent these conflicts that push people away from their country of origin, but we are responsible for what we do when people arrive into our countries. And what we see is aggressive, lengthy, re-traumatizing asylum interviews that, in one case took 12 hours. One woman, as I showed you up there, was asked over 500 questions. No opportunity, no automatic breaks. People are too frightened to say, excuse me, I need to use the bathroom. They do not want to cause trouble. They want to please the caseworker because they fear upsetting them will mean their claim is denied. There's a long and proven relationship between waiting, between destitution and psychological disorders. The longer somebody waits for a decision, and the more often they're made destitute because they're in and out of asylum systems, the more likely they are to see an exacerbation of mental health problems. We also heard of PTSD from experiences in asylum interviews, from being in detention centres and from being in shared housing. Being in detention centres, being denied access to medication, to being denied access to sanitary products and having to put in a written request to access these things. SGBV in asylum and refugee housing, mixing genders up when you know someone has disclosed SGBV. SGBV when homeless, in and out of asylum, accommodation, detention, homelessness. And this is, in Australia, this is in Sweden and in the UK. Prostitution and trafficking, still a risk once in refuge. Intensification of IPV, interpersonal violence, and use of immigration status by those who have got leave to remain to control those who don't. Economic abuse, deprivation of resources, lack of safe spaces, and for people who are trying to escape domestic violence, and also for LGBTQI victims. Discrimination, particularly for those who are Muslim, who are wearing hijab, who are clearly, of a different faith, and insufficient specialist services. We also recorded the health effects and whether people were able to access healthcare along the journey, but also once in refuge. And what we found was very few had received treatment. Our researchers met people who didn't leave the house. And we are doing research in Wales and Scotland now at the request of the devolved assemblies. And still we're finding people who don't leave the home. Their food is delivered by grassroots organisations and they stay at home. They're too frightened to go to the doctor because they think there's only male doctors. And maybe they've got some urinary difficulty, which means they can't leave the house. Or maybe they're too frightened because they hear a car horn beep and they fear that they're going to be shot at, or they see a man in uniform and they worry about what that man will do to them. So they're not accessing treatment and no one's reaching out to them. This is not everybody because there are some brilliant small organisations out there that are doing work, but we are finding these people. There's a complex, and this is part of the problem, I think, very complex nature of cumulative experiences, long histories of abuse, and we don't have in countries of refuge the recording and recovery mechanisms we need. So there's a lack of capacity to even record these complex problems. Okay. And I've listed some of the health issues here, but for many, you are looking at a combination of psychological and physical health impacts. And I think, there's a wonderful quote here from an Iraqi refugee in Australia. She says, you don't get these shocks and challenges from one place, you get them from multiple places, and there's no one or nothing to help us to get us out of the situation we're in. Okay. So we have identified 5 interactions between sexual and gender-based violence, migration, and humanitarian and asylum systems. The first is that there is a lack of services for forced migrants on the move. So, as I already said, not many people were able to access it. Everyone believed once they're on the move, I'm illegal. I don't have the right to report that I've been raped. I don't have the right to access healthcare in this country, and there's no other healthcare made available to them. So they struggled. The second is the encouragement of a kind of dependency that breeds violence. So restrictive policies that enforce dependency on perpetrators. Your remaining in this country is dependent on the outcome of your partner's asylum claim, and you have to remain in that relationship. Or it's a forced migrant who's married someone who's a forced migrant who's now got citizen status, and their ability to remain in that country depends on their being in a relationship for 4 years. Yes, there are in many countries things like a domestic violence rule. Who's going to tell someone who can't speak the local language? Is the abuser going to say to them, did you know that there's a domestic violence rule and you can leave me and you can get support? So the information's not getting out there. And without access to public funds, because many are made financially dependent, not being allowed to work, threatened with deportation, returning home to shame, stigma, potential of honour-based violence, people remain. They don't know any different. Next, we have traumatic asylum processes. These are prolonged asylum procedures that put forced migrants' lives on hold, not for weeks, not for months, sometimes for many years, sometimes even for decades. We met respondents who said, I've been waiting 8 years for a decision, and still they won't allow me leave to remain because they refuse to believe that I'm gay, and I don't know how to prove it. They've asked me for photos. I don't know what photos to send them. Asylum processes actually actively re-traumatize people. by asking over and over again different people or different points in the same interview about the same experiences. And they're not sharing. So if people are in a human trafficking process and an asylum process, you have to share this information with both. There's no crossover. So it exacerbates existing trauma. And often after very distressing asylum interviews, you leave there and you've got to find your own way home. There's no counselling, there's no debriefing, there's no support. You're on your own to deal with everything you've just had to say and everything you've been told. Fourth is unstable and unsafe accommodation. This is a story all the way across the continuum of violence. Accommodation that you can stay in for a day, a week, and we're beginning to see this in Ukraine. Accommodation that's unsafe because it's mixed gender, or there are wires hanging out of the wall, the roof is leaking, it's unsanitary, and mixing genders when people have experienced SGBV, particularly like detention centres or hostels, reception hostels, without putting locks on bathroom doors, massively anxiety and risk. Appropriate provision is absolutely central to a victim's safety. But what we find is where shelters are available, it's dependent on you being able to access public resources. They're only available for restricted periods. So we found that homelessness for many of our respondents was pretty common. All the time, every time you're homeless, you're at further risk of exploitation. And then our sort of fifth one is being that there being very limited SGBV sensitivity, immigration and asylum systems, but also in mainstream systems like National Health Services, and the lack of capacity. And as I said, it's complex. It's really, really complex. I've just been doing research in Wales, and I'm hearing that actually some women are disclosing pretty early after arrival, and the people they're disclosing to just don't know what to do with that information. But, they lack that capacity. That isn't something that's so difficult to deal with. Pathways and mechanisms in place. But restricted availability of female interpreters is a big issue. And there's very little consideration about the needs of men, the needs of boys, which is a massive issue in Sweden, and LGBTQ. Okay. I'm getting close to the end now, and there's a lot more I could say, and I really urge you to look at the report, because we have brought those stories. You'll be able to access all of those graphics, but also many of the words of the people we spoke to, because they can tell it an awful lot better than we can. But just to say, we also look forward. We know that integration is a priority in many of global North nations. We want refugees to integrate. It's something we talk about a lot. But what we don't really think about is how SGBV experiences, including the ones in refuge, but also those on journey, actually undermine people's ability to integrate. There needs to be systems put in place to support people to recover before you expect them to learn the language, to get a job, and so on. Although for many, engaging in integration processes, volunteering in organizations, learning the language, meeting other people, particularly building social networks, are really important for recovery from trauma, and they also protect against further SGBV. So, we noticed that, looking across the 4 countries, or 5 countries in the end, and then focusing on, how can you take people forward, there were 5 areas that we really need to think about. Of course, can you integrate without legal status? No, because you're worried about what's going to happen to you. Safe and stable housing, you've heard it from me already. Access to healthcare, education, social networks, super important, and local language skills and culture. Enable people to recover and then access those services, then they are able to make a life for themselves, and they are able to. So, in the report, we have an awful lot of recommendations. The recommendations, so how do we form the recommendations? Well, firstly, we said to survivors and service providers, what needs to change, okay? We looked across our findings, and amongst the team, we thought about what needs to change, and then we went out and we consulted. So Sandra ran a very comprehensive consultation over the last few months with lots of individuals, wider organisation, IFRC have spoken to us a lot, but many other organisations too. We talked about our recommendations for them. And, we are continuing to discuss what needs to change. It's, subject of the panel, and there's a roundtable tomorrow. So within the report, what we've done is we've set out roles for humanitarian agencies, roles for government, and roles for funders as well. But essentially what we're asking for is the mainstreaming. It's no good having a project here and a project there, although there's a huge amount of expertise in those projects. It's important to mainstream migrant, gender and trauma-sensitive SGBV approaches into all the systems we have, humanitarian, immigration and asylum systems. So we need those kind of sensitive programs, and we need to make sure that there's provision when people are on the move, not just in a camp, not just in refuge, although as we've established, there's not a lot anyway. And we need gender-sensitive asylum procedures. We need to treat forced migrant victims of SGBV the same way as we treat anyone who walks into a police station to disclose what's happened to them. With care, with sensitivity, we need to give them time, we need to give them space, and we need to give them the opportunity. Oh, I better put these links on. But as I say, you can just Google SEREDA Birmingham, and you can access a huge range of materials, including the report, which has gone live, I think, online just about now.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for giving us that overview. And as Jenny said, there's a range of materials available online that you can look at. Before I turn to the panel, I just wanted to check if anybody had any questions for Jenny around the research and the findings. No, because we're live stream. So there you go. If you just introduce yourself, and then we'll take a couple questions. It should be on.
Hello. Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Adarsh. I'm an anthropologist at the Graduate Institute of Chemistry. And I'm doing my research as well on, the performative and narrative mechanisms queer asylum seekers use to prove their queerness. So the questions might be a bit strange. So I think the first thing that really struck me was you mentioned that you had certain mechanisms in place to make sure that people aren't re-traumatized while you were doing this research, and it'd be very interesting for me to know from my own research about what they were. And I have more questions that you want me to take.
Probably we could talk afterwards. Yeah, and there'll be a chance to chat afterwards if you want to talk about those processual issues.
I'm going to grab a couple questions. If that's okay.
Okay.
Great, thank you so much. Shirin Haydari, also from the Graduate Institute. Thank you so much for your super interesting research and very timely. I want to ask, did you see notice any notable differences between these different countries that you looked at? I mean, they obviously have very different both migration policies and socioeconomic context. What was the key findings in terms of lessons learned across those countries?
Thank you. I've got two more, and then I'll come back to you, Jenny.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm Louise Rocheteau. I'm policy officer at the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. I'm working on migration. Thank you for the research and for the presentations. And thank you also to highlight men, boys, and LGBTQI+. It's not something that we see frequently, I think, in reports. I have one question related to organizational change and the profile of some staff you mentioned in several recommendations. For example, male interviewers or interpreters. I saw also caseworkers. I saw related to the housing that staff are abusive, and so it's about humanitarian workers and government aid. And I was wondering, it's a broad question, but if you have more detail on the profile, it is more the government aid that are abusive, or it's more the humanitarian agencies. Yes, and yeah, it's a bit a broad question. I don't know if you went deeper in your research, but I would be curious about that. And if you have more trends on it is a lack of policies and guidelines in place. If policies and guidelines are in place, they are not implemented. It is a problem of training of staff or other trends. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luis. If you can't get all of them now, Jenny, we can also throw some of those back to the panel if you like later.
Hi, I'm Gina, Graduate Institute and University of Lausanne. I was wondering during your presentation, where is the human agency of this population? I mean, what about networking? What about how to know the roots in the sense of preventing the sexual violence or gender-based violence?
Thank you. So Jenny, I'm going to come back to you and we will have more time for questions later. So.
Right. So I'm just thinking what to go with first. Are there policies and guidelines? That's an interesting question, because certainly in relation to asylum systems, there are very detailed policies and guidelines. So, they're often like gender sensitive interview guidelines. I think the problem is that quite often the policies and guidelines are not implemented. So they might be there and they operate maybe at quite a high level, but what actually happens maybe on the front line or in the asylum interview is something quite different. And for us, it's very difficult because we've been talking to policymakers, people who write these guidelines, in asylum systems, and they'll say, well, we train our people not to do this, but the fact is their people are doing it. They say, well, it's a very stressful experience. Maybe the survivor misunderstands, but now we're getting access to the transcripts of these interviews, which are going to enable us to demonstrate exactly where the guidelines are not followed. So when I said SEREDA is a kind of ongoing thing, that's the next sort of stage for us to take, it's a missing piece of the puzzle. And then it's very difficult to say, but this is just, the voice of the survivor. Maybe they were confused. In terms of men, boys, LGBTQ, I'm glad that you're pleased that we talked about that. It was really difficult, actually, because we employed an all-woman team, and we didn't have a lot of experience or connections with the LGBT sector. And actually, that was really important. So whilst we did encounter some people, maybe I think 15 people who were LGBTQI, 3 trans women, we would have liked to have had more of those conversations, and we would have liked to engage better with service providers in that space. But we have a plan for moving forward, which is about making our research much more sensitive to that population. And in terms of men as well, men and boys, it's really difficult to get men to talk about this kind of stuff. And I think that's an area there's so much scope. I'm wondering how much more you want me to answer. Agency, that's such an important question. Every single person who's made this journey is agentic. Actually taking this journey, moving forward, putting one foot in front of the other on a daily basis is agentic. Not killing yourself, sorry, but this is something that people actively work at. That's agency. But they need resources to be agentic with. And unfortunately, we take away all their power. So what they have less, and Sandra can probably talk about this quite a bit, is their faith and their kids. They put all of their effort, all of their thought, everything into their faith and their children, because that's, that they're the things they can hold on to. And of course, some have lost their children as well.
I would like to add some.
Maybe before you add, I'm just going to introduce you. Otherwise, people don't know who's on our panel. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. But I'll just introduce the panel, and then I'll let you, Sandra, answer that, and then we can have a few other questions. So it is my pleasure to introduce this wonderful panel. You've all met Jenny so far, and maybe I'll start with you, Sandra, since Jenny has referred to you several times. So Dr. Sandra Pertek is a gender specialist with over a decade of experience in international development and migration settings in Africa, Middle East, and North Africa. And she's a SEREDA Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. And her research has explored SGBV amongst forced migrants in Turkey and Tunisia. To her right is Sweet Abadi, a social educator and currently the co-coordinator of AMIC, the Association de Médiatrices Interculturelles de Genève, sorry, a Geneva-based NGO, which was founded by refugees for refugees. And AMIC's work focuses on the empowerment of refugee women, children, and youth. And GBV is one of the main issues that they're tackling. So I think for that arrival piece, Sweet is going to have some more to bring to the table on those some questions. Further down the line, we have Emily Page, who is a senior gender-based violence officer at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Before she joined headquarters here in Geneva, she was coordinating interagency working groups and managed GBV and protection programs in different places, including Jordan, Lebanon, Yemen, Tunisia, and Greece. And she's worked closely with refugee women and girls and LGBTQI plus communities on refugee-led initiatives to prevent GBV. And last but definitely not least, we have Lisa Acaro from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Lisa is the global lead on protection, gender, and inclusion in emergencies and institutional capacities. She has a master's in disaster management and has worked as an emergency responder, providing psychosocial support and working on protection, gender, and inclusion with case management experience and working in different locations of the Red Cross movement, including the regional branch in Norway, where she's from, the headquarters in Norway, and now at headquarters here in Geneva, but has also worked in a number of disasters. So a huge range of experience from the panel. Before I ask any more questions, I'm going to let Sandra, you answer the panel questions from the audience that you were going to come
Thank you, Manisha. I would just pick up the question about human agency and the differences between the countries that lady there asked. So obviously, the survivors demonstrated incredible levels of resilience, and they were on their own throughout these journeys. And upon arrival to countries of refuge, they found on their own ways of coping. And yes, in our presentation, we didn't present the slide on resilience, but if you look at the report, you will find out more about it. What we found is that people have a range of different coping methods. So every one of us has a different coping strategy. We know what helps us survive crisis. And in the stories, we heard incredible levels of resilience that manifested in a range of emotional, behavioral, and active strategies. And one of them was counting on their faith. And yes, praying to God, praying to whatever power people believed in that will help them survive this crisis, because the humanity let them down. So what they were counting on was the wider power that could help them survive. And well, there were a range of behavioral techniques, like people were seeking work actively, even if it's informal work. They would try to learn a language, they would try to seek connections, they would use a range of different resources and connections. Well, I call it resources. We have a range of different human capital and social capital resources that people try to recall and build on. But I need to highlight that many of them had very little social connections, and they relied only what's within them, so their worldview, their belief system. And then on the second question from my right, yes, there were major differences between several countries of our study. But we can group them, UK, Sweden, Australia, as countries of resettlement and refuge, whilst the Tunisia and Turkey as countries of temporary protection and countries of transit. We see major differences between those. Obviously, Tunisia and Turkey as perhaps, well, Tunisia was standing out from across all countries because this was the least resource setting where migrants were waiting for a long time to continue their journeys. They just crossed from Libya. They were rescued over they were rescued from the Mediterranean Sea, and well, there was very little support. There were very, very little public support. The vouchers that they were given, they were below poverty lines. There was huge destitution, but they were safe. That's what we may say. There was discrimination, racism, and other forms of violence, like the structural violence, but there was much less interpersonal violence. In Turkey, there was this incident of informal aiders who were trying to harass women who were settled in Turkey for a long time. I was really surprised because all of my respondents said that there were men approaching them in exchange for sexual relations. So we can call it transactional sex offers, in exchange for simple things, shopping and accommodation. That was really widespread in this setting, and a major legal differences, because obviously in Turkey, apply for asylum likewise. In Tunisia they couldn't, and in UK, Sweden, and Australia there were pathways to seek refuge.
Thanks very much, Sandra. And we will have another chance for more questions from the audience, but I'm first going to throw a big question at my panel to get us started. I mean, we've heard from both Jenny and Sandra, the research has really identified that SGBV is a challenge throughout the journey and that people are often re-traumatized. And just on that point, Louise, that you'd asked about, is it humanitarian workers or staff of governments? I was just checking with Jenny, but she said it was everyone. And then the researchers didn't go into the details in order to not re-traumatize people unless they mentioned it. But I think the fact that there are cases of GBV across the journey is what we really need to tackle. So based on that, and given your experiences, what needs to change to be able to stop this repeated pattern of gender-based violence along the journey from as they're moving until they arrive in countries of asylum? Who needs to make those changes? What do those changes need to be? And how do we start going about them? And I think particularly in Europe now, given the range of people moving in Ukraine, and again, the predators that are being identified out there, what do we need to do now, not only for the Ukraine response, but for all responses where refugees are fleeing? Stuart, since you haven't had a chance to speak, would you like to go first?
Okay, so I guess I work with a nonprofit that is based in Geneva. So I will address the aspect of the issue, part of the issue that happens once survivors arrive in the destination country. We see a lot of women that arrive that have been traumatized and re-traumatized, like we've seen in the report. And once they arrive here, unfortunately, they don't necessarily have access to services that they should have access to. There's a center, I can speak for Switzerland, for example, the largest center for victims is called La Vie. And this is a service, for example, that a lot of refugee women don't have access to if the violence happened outside Switzerland. So it's not recognized as something that gives access to services once in Switzerland. So that brings a whole set of issues because a lot of these women are arriving with a lot of psychological trauma. As mentioned before, they're having issues integrating into society. They're having issues learning new skills. They're having issues connecting and feeling safe. So if these issues are not tackled quite early on in the integration process, it creates a whole set of other repercussions. And these are, mental health issues that we're seeing, inability to develop healthy relationships with their children once they are parents. And that also, has its own set of repercussions on the children, on their lives, etc. So this is one big issue that in Switzerland, for example, that a lot of victims have. Another major issue is the issue of economic violence. This is something that is very present in the stories that we hear from women that we work with, because there is obviously an economic imbalance. Usually, if it's if one of them works, it's usually the husband that works, and so he is the sole breadwinner in a majority of these cases. So when there is violence in the couple, it is nearly impossible to imagine leaving. But this could be expected. But what is maybe a bit surprising is that the stipend that is received from the government to refugees in Switzerland is given only to one person in the household, and that is usually the man. And when we bring up this issue to the service providers, we see a huge lack of understanding of how violence mechanisms operate. So they tell us, well, we don't decide who gets the stipend. They could you know, if they ask us that the stipend is received in the woman's account, we have no problem with that. So they kind of push that responsibility onto victims in a lot of ways. And so these are the types of issues that we're seeing once women arrive here that perpetuate this cycle of violence.
For the question, I think that long, unfortunately, and scope of GBV affecting refugee women. I think overall, I mean, there's changes that we need to increase services and quality services that are survivor-centered and well is the gaps when it comes to refugees who are on the move and who are crossing different countries. Often they're unsafe situations at the hands of smugglers or traffickers who are perpetrators of gender-based violence. I think there, you know, there should be much more presence in some of those remote locations, border areas. There is no rule of law. Smugglers are the law. I think that's a big issue, but also in terms of outreach, ensuring that marginalized women, have access to information about GBV services, and that's also a big challenge. And what we've seen best is if this outreach is done by refugee women themselves or refugee networks, and you know, it's very important to also involve marginalized refugees. And then what needs to change is also refugee women and girls are the experts. We need to work much more directly and fund directly women-led organizations, particularly led directly by refugee women. Time when we talk a lot about response, we should not forget that programming in more like static environment or more in countries of asylum, but that we need to invest much more in prevention. Invest in multi-year programming to tackle gender transformative programming to really change. And the last point is funding. Currently, we are the GBV subsector is funded only at 3%. And again, expression, but I think we have to say things, you know, directly. We need to put, you know, our money where our mouth is, and you know, fund much more GBV programs, particularly.
Super, thank you, Lisa. You've got to really stick the microphone near your mouth for the benefit of those
I will
online,
pick it up.
apparently. Thank you.
Thank you. You've asked the huge question, Manisha, as you usually do when you have these.
I'd like to make it easy for you.
I want to just smoothly follow on your last point on funding, Emily, to begin with, because I really think it taps into kind of my main point, I think, would be that we have to keep trying to fight to make this absolutely everyone's business. And yes, mainstream, and stop working by boxes and weird headlines that don't make sense, weird definitions that don't make sense for the people we're talking about, and for those at risk, which is really all of us, no? When it comes to the broader SGBV issues. But on funding, I just wanted to, I'm not sure you're all aware, I think a good example is Oxfam has been able to put a minimum standard type of gender tax on all of their funding, which is kind of like an overhead, so that they're ensuring that mainstreaming through all of their programs and operations. It's something that certainly I would love to see happen for our organization as well. Anyways, not today. Yes, I think we have to make it everyone's business. I think we have to work from all kinds of angles on this and not leave it with the specialist portfolio holders to deal with it. Because it is everyone's business. It affects whole societies, everyone. It really, really, destroys our opportunities to evolve, to develop, to function, to innovate, to deal with climate. Because we if we keep blocking half at least of the great minds that are in our societies from functioning properly or from being able to own their own bodies and minds, then how are we ever going to solve the new problems that are coming every day? So, huge question. I want to say maybe a few things about these boxes. We have a lot of boxes when we talk about SGBV. We categorize people, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, all of these boxes for people, women, men, LGBT, like what are you, age boxes. We have all these boxes, right? We also have all kinds of legal boxes, and which I think are quite pose barriers to us as well quite often to dealing with this here in Europe, especially here in Switzerland. Right now, they are trying to change the definition of rape. By law in Switzerland, it is now only considered rape if there is penetration by a penis. That's the only, that's the legal definition of rape here in Switzerland. I'm being vocal, but this is what we're talking about, no? And if that's the only way to recognize rape in a whole country, how do we then start talking about sexual and gender-based violence that is happening to so many people? So that's one box we need to tackle, the legal box and the legal frameworks. And this we have to do together, all of us. I'm talking to ourselves as humanitarians, but also governments and private sector, everyone who can contribute to this in terms of funding as well. We have boxes on definitions. We have different set of rights for people who are potentially identified as potential victims of trafficking. They get a reflection period. In Norway, they get 6 months of protection just to contemplate, be safe, and consider whether or not they are willing to report to the police. SGBV survivors don't get anything like that. I mean, if they maybe dare to disclose what's happened to them, no, there's no protection. In Norway, no. I mean, this is for the general population. So when you add the layer of racism that we know is happening everywhere as well to that, of course, the access to fulfillment of rights for migrant women or boys or men or whoever, whatever box we put, is literally not there. Yeah, these are some of the boxes. We also box violence. We talk about it a lot. That I think sometimes provides this distance between us who work on this and the people we, need to actually have steer where this is going, namely those most at risk or those surviving it. We use terms that are not very easy to identify with. Just SGBV being an example. If you don't know what that acronym means, it's none of your business, right? And this also for the general humanitarian worker or the general social worker, the general asylum process, immigration officer, right? They don't know what that acronym means. It's not relevant to them. I think we need to change a lot of things. Our language, our funding, our approach, break the boxes and everyone get involved, please.
I think that's exactly that call to action that Frank was talking about at the beginning, that this research really calls on all of us to do something about it. Sandra, I know you want to come in, and then Jenny perhaps, and then I'll come to the audience for questions.
I'd like to build on what Lisa has just said and just highlight this moral responsibility across different sectors and different levels, individuals, communities, and then society as at large and all the policy. If we look at the way we are structured from like the closer circles around us and then people further away and the global policies and international, we need to deploy like strategies at different levels to help raise awareness amongst individuals and across different sectors, not only humanitarian, but also reaching out to this immigration and asylum systems procedures to ensure that this sensitivity to forced migrant status, being illegal in certain states, often in many circumstances being illegal, endangers, creates a range of vulnerabilities. And this is very close to this intersectional approach that we are so proud of, and we are all the time trying to integrate it across different programs. I feel like there is a little neglect of including the migrant status of people in the programs how we develop. We look at age, gender, disability, but there's little accountability and little accounting for the migrant status. Now we have this movement to decolonize things, and we are anti-racial. We are trying to fight racial discrimination, yes, but migrant status is another vulnerability that should be accounted for, because there's so many drivers of violence based on someone's migrant status. And another point, very quick, it's about the default, taking violence against migrants as the default position. Unfortunately, this will be around from 70% as a minimum. Like many studies, not only SEREDA, but demonstrates that at least 70% of forced migrants are exposed to violence upon arrival to country of refuge. And this number is higher during the journey. So we need to take it as a default that unfortunately people arriving, seeking asylum of different statuses were subjected at some point of their journey or their life to gender-based violence, sexual gender-based violence. And we need to lead people, guide them to the right supports. Of course, we know that, yes, 1 in 3 women globally is exposed to violence. If we just focus on forced migrant women, the proportion is much higher, and we need to develop customized solutions to this group, these populations, to be able to extraordinary prevalence of violence. Yeah, this is all coming with economic costs, and if we do it right, we could save lots of money that we're spending in health systems later on and others. I'll go.
Well, I'm not going to add an awful lot to that. But, one of the things that we haven't talked about is, the normalization of violence, and that actually we really need to be working with men. So men as victims, but also men as perpetrators. The number of respondents who told us that, well, there's nothing I could do because I'm. So it goes kind of beyond the migration systems back to what happens with aid and development. So, investing in women, but also investing in changing women, making men matter, giving, finding ways to empower women so that they do maybe create something that men value, as well as obviously talking about the importance of equality. And, impunity is another one. But, the reason this happens is because there is impunity. And I know someone over there said, is it government officials? Is it humanitarian workers? The answer is it's anyone who wants to do it and thinks they can get away with it. What we found in Australia was that when the perpetrators found out what they were doing was illegal and they would be prosecuted and there would be consequences for them, they didn't turn into lovely people, but they did stop hitting their wives. They did stop beating their wives, because there was the impunity was taken away. That's what we need across the board. And then, of course, that means safe journeys, safe routes for escape, safe pathways. But impunity, I don't know how to end impunity, but certainly we need to be thinking about those. Otherwise, I think it'll continue.
I'm going to check. Thank you to all of you. I mean, it was a big question, but it sets the stage, hopefully, for more specific questions, potentially. I wanted to see if there's any questions from the audience, and that way we can throw those to the panel. I mean, I have lots more, but I figure the audience will have better questions. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Meg Davis. I'm at the Graduate Institute also, another one of us here today, and also on the steering committee on sexual violence at the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Studies. congratulations, the study is very impressive and really fantastic work, and really looking forward to reading the full report. So really appreciate that. My question is for IFRC, and I have to say I was really concerned to hear a senior official from IFRC in 2021 saying that he's shocked to learn about sexual violence among refugees and migrants, because the resolution by the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement was passed in 2015. So what I'd like to hear from IFRC is what resources you are putting in right now to address this issue, and specifically personnel. Do you have people who are experts on SGBV, responding to the crisis in Ukraine? And please, let's move past the vague, platitudes and language and talk concretely how you're going to take these recommendations and take them forward. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much. I've got a question here.
Also for IFRC, I think one thing, Lisa, you mentioned was that in Norway, for example, with, well, I forget exactly who it was, but there is like a retainer period where you can reflect on these issues and things like that. And if you want something like that for asylum seekers, because I also heard that there was a recommendation, I think it was a second point or something that Jenny made, that we don't want to prolong the duration too much for the application. So where do we strike that balance between prolonging and shortening? Because Switzerland did recently shorten their asylum procedure significantly to 90 days 3 years ago. And it's not all good. I mean, there's a lot of negative feedback to that, because then people don't have enough time to, well, just figure out how the system works and prepare their testimony, things like that. But also you don't want to prolong it because then it's too much. So yeah, it's a bit of a catch-22, but your take on that.
Super, thank you very much. Pascal.
Thank you very much for everything you've shared so far. It's extremely important, and I feel very privileged to be able to listen to you. I have a different type of question. My question is, throughout your research, but also throughout your experience, have you identified moments or spaces in which cultural institutions, cultural players can really make a difference, or play an active role, or contribute to something? Basically, how can we help? That's my question.
I love it. You're looking for solutions, so that's excellent. You're coming up for the call. So now you all have an opportunity to provide some of those answers to that. Maybe Lisa, though, I start with you for that very specific IFRC question.
Thank you for that. I do welcome those kinds of, it's not, yeah, thank you. I would like to reply to the other one first, though, because I have a feeling so I think, to me, that I fully agree. You can see too long periods and too short periods, both ways. The main point is what you fill that time with, and how you make that time valuable for whoever is in that waiting. Because waiting can also, I worked on the Ocean Viking last fall, in the boat in the Mediterranean on the search and rescue mission. And 1 hour of waiting on that boat, is challenging to fill with something meaningful, because and waiting for 3 days or 4 days before you get to safe port, it seems like an absolute eternity, no matter what situation you're in. And this is just waiting. So we know that waiting in itself is a method of torture, right? No information, all of these things. So it really, really depends on what you fill that time with, and how you structure that period, and how you protect people in that period from themselves and from their traumas. Thank you for that question. Again, I do wish my dear director was here to reply for himself. I gotta be honest with you. But I will reply with a mix of what we are doing and some of what I would like to see us doing, because it's not always that I get my way in our organization, if that's okay. So yes, it feels sometimes quite banal to the extent in which we have to repeat ourselves on these topics, also internally. I mean, our organization is huge, as you know. We have 192 national societies. The IFRC, the ICRC, we collaborate with, we work together as well. We have colleagues from the ICRC here that work specifically on preventing and responding to sexual violence and conflict, so that's why I'm pointing as well. But what we are currently doing is very much that, trying to collaborate much closer, coordinate much better, first and foremost. Because we've seen over the last few years, we recently did a review. Norwegian Red Cross wanted us to, really look at how we work on this. Are we centralized enough, or are we centralized too much? Do we have too much high-level headquarter expertise and then not actually disseminate it in the work on the ground that we need to see happen? Or is it the other way around? Are we mainstreaming too much, not building that capacity of the teachers to then train new mainstreaming efforts in that sense, right? So it's a very comprehensive review that we've just done. And the findings as of now are that we need a bit of both. We need all of it. We need to invest more in specialized skills and research. And this is also why we're very happy to continue this partnership with SEREDA, because we know we can't do it all as well. So really, really important to increase specialized focus on this. But at the same time, our coordination is really key. At the Secretariat IFRC, this is what we're supposed to do, right? Coordinate between the national societies. And as they keep working, staff and volunteers in Syria, in Lebanon, in Sweden, in Turkey, wherever they are in the world, they gain their experiences and they face their different challenges. And this is what our task is, to really capture that and bring it back out to the rest of the membership again. This investment is something that I think we need to do a lot more of. I think we need to invest much more as well in our coordination efforts. Make sure we have the right level of capacity and competencies, specialization in the right place and at the right time, and not have it sit, have a specialist on SGBV sit somewhere to write nice things, right? But to really try to get it out to all the corners of our movement. The resolution is very much still guiding us, and yeah, I will leave it to Frank to speak for himself on that statement. I'm afraid not defend him with him not being here, but there's a lot to do, and I don't think we'll ever get there. But
thank you, Lisa. I'm going to turn to the other panelists to come back on some of those other questions, including what can we do as a cultural institution like the museum. Emily, and then I'll come. Got the mic. I thought you wanted it.
That's fine. No, I think that cultural institutions and art in general art institutions have a lot of role to play as well. Particularly, for example, what I've seen in my experience, quite powerful in the context of GBV prevention, for example. I've worked with a group of Syrian refugee women in Jordan who created animated videos on different topics, including sensitive topics, child marriage, on sexual violence against boys, for example. And brilliant group of young women were self-taught. They did those animated videos by themselves with quite little support, and it was really quite powerful to then see the impact on the communities. And such it had a really positive effect. And I think having cultural institutions invest more in joint projects with refugees, or like co-lead projects with refugee women, with refugee LGBTQI plus communities and so on. I think it's really important. And I've worked also in Yakima refugee camp. I think it's often on the news because it's a place where we have so many refugee artists, amazing singers who are also using their voices to talk about GBV and prevent it within their communities. We worked with a youth group who are also doing their own movies to prevent FGM and child marriage. So there is really a lot of potential, and I would encourage institutions to, everyone has a role to play.
What Emily just said, so cultural institutions are a key point of connect, I believe, right? This is where people of all different walks of life come and exchange. And what Emily was just saying, there are many artists among forced migrants. Maybe this could be a place where people of different migrant status could be given a chance to exhibit and to convey, provide them space to creatively create something or to connect. This is a place where people can find ways of healing, I believe, because they will be here. First of all, creating things. They might be having an opportunity, one in their lifetime of what, I don't know, a year, whatever, a week, a safe space where they can come and they can exchange their experiences or and then there are also opportunities for volunteering. People who are waiting for their asylum status are just people I met are so willing to volunteer. They want to occupy their time because they are not allowed to work and they're not allowed to study in many countries. So what fills their time is thinking and relieving their HGPV experiences or other traumatic experiences. So any opportunity for volunteering and creating things would help them recover from their traumas. And this could be also a place for safe referrals. If you could be trained to provide a safe referral to survivors to be able to access health service or legal support or a justice system. Yeah, that probably a range of different ideas. I will move on.
Super, thank you. Sweet.
Just going to add to that a little bit. I think they have pretty much covered it, but yeah, to say open up their institutions could open up their spaces to refugees and migrants, because a lot of times it's not a population that easily frequents these spaces, and waiting for them to come to these spaces is not necessarily very, as you know, because I know that you're already working on this thematic, but but also hiring them, making them part of your team, and really seeking out their contributions to help transform these institutions from within.
I agree with all of that, but just to say that they offer a space where stories can be told so that we can help understand each other a bit better, so it's a place of exchange as well. And I was gonna, everything I was gonna say is gone, so it's fantastic. But I just wanted to say on the question of 90 days and, should we do this or should we do that? What we should do is we should be asking forced migrants, what works for them. So if someone's experienced SGBV, why aren't we saying, do you feel you're ready to go through the asylum process, or do you need some time to heal? We could be humane and do that and not make the decision for them.
Thank you very much. I think those are some very concrete ways forward, I think. And that whole point about in organizations, the fact that we're still not prioritizing GBV, I think is something that we see over and over. And even that point that you raised about the lack of funding that goes to GBV, many humanitarian organizations get unearmarked funding that they could put towards GBV if they so chose to do so. And I think the research will hopefully really highlight that that is an important part of what all humanitarian organizations should be doing. I'm going to open up the floor again for other questions, comments. Thank you. Just put your hand up on that we get the mic to you next.
Great, thank you so much again, and excellent discussion. And I would like to kind of follow up on Pascal's invitation as well. And I absolutely think cultural institutions have a great role to play. And again, creating that space for creativity has actually therapeutical potentials for people that have experience of trauma. And there's lots of studies around traumatic experiences and using art as a way of therapeutics. I think maybe projects working with mental health providers or psychologists could be actually much better entry point, specifically when language barrier always exists for migrants and refugees, access to services and so on and so forth. At the same time, I would like to also encourage cultural institutions, humanitarian institutions, to be also self-reflective. Cultural institutions in all countries are one of those most difficult to penetrate. They're extremely homogeneous, they're very difficult, they're not necessarily very inviting to kind of diversity. So I think I have to say the same goes sometimes in humanitarian context. We also need to reflect on how does our institutional policies, operation, the norms that we create in our institution actually continue to reinforce what we are seeing in the real world and we want to change, but we blindly continue to do that. And with that note, I think when we are discussing around how to respond to SGBV, we also need to kind of really think about the bigger structural factors that facilitates for this to continuously happen. I think migration policies, the politics as large, the economic policies and politics, I think we also should not lose sight of bringing attention to those that while we try to accelerate response to SGBV, we need at the same time to change the structural factors that creates conditions which really facilitate that both from an institutional point of view as well as a national and political EU supranational point of view. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to address all of these.
Just another small question for you. I've got another question in the middle there, please. I'll just take a couple more and then come to you.
Hi there, thanks very much to the panel. I'm Chris, I'm a teacher here in Geneva, and I also coordinate a local group of Amnesty International supporters. You'll know Amnesty believe in people power, and Jenny, you mentioned advocacy as a big aim for the report. We're often talking to people in the public, out and about in Geneva. What can the person on the street do with all of this information? They won't have time to read maybe the whole report, come to events like this. But is there a petition they can sign? Is there someone they can write to? We try and direct them to local initiatives that are supporting refugee and things like that. But if you could put some things in a nutshell, what can the average person do?
Super, thank you very much. Any other question? Sorry. Any other questions? Or maybe we'll take those because that was quite a big question over there and some very specific ones. I'm going to start with Lisa and then, because you had your hand up first. Mike, sorry. And then I'll come back to you, Jenny, and then go this way.
Is on? Yeah. Just got to eat it again. Sorry, I'm not going to elaborate fully on that question, but it's extremely important. And actually, is something that I was almost mentioning on the last point as well, related to how we're investing in SGBV prevention, mitigation, and response in the IFRC. And currently, we talk about also agency and how engagement, participation, etc. For us, being a volunteer organization around the world, obviously, migrant women and refugees and asylum seekers are part of our workforce. They're part of our volunteers. Also men and adolescents, above 18, of course, but, and this is a huge part of how we work, right? So we try. Turkish context is a very good example. The Turkish Red Crescent have, engaged and involved the very large Syrian population in Turkey that are seeking protection in running activities in all kinds of community centers across the country. Not just, volunteering in them, but running. And with that perspective, of course, we have to look at our own institutions and organizations as well. And not just because we seek to promote that diversity in all of our levels in the organization. We are a diverse organization globally, but because we know that these power imbalances and this racism and, we're just products of our own communities, all of us, right? So we're not going to separate ourselves as, I'm a humanitarian, I'm not, I'm different. There's no distance in that sense. So we are investing a lot these days in safeguarding and in looking at our own diversity inclusion mechanisms. Amjad, my manager, just came from a Council of Delegates session on anti-racism and discrimination, where we're looking at our own organization, our own movement. How can we do this internally? Because we, how do we even practice? How do we practice what we preach? Basically, start with ourselves.
Super, thank you very much. Jenny, I know you wanted to come in on this one. I'll let you have it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to respond to what can the person in the street do, because I am a firm believer that the person in the street can make a huge difference. The way our politicians act, they're trying to give us what they think we want, and particularly around migration and particularly around forced migration. This is a highly politicized issue. So actually, I've spent quite a lot of time and a lot of effort in podcasts and blogs and, talking to the media and actually saying there are things you can do. So you can challenge. You should be approaching your local politicians at all levels and questioning why this is happening. Of course, people need the knowledge in the first instance. So you should be asking questions, you should be challenging, but you can donate money, you can volunteer. There is so much that you can do. And my sort of initial dream for this project, which hasn't come true, is that, I wanted to reach out to the Me Too movement. GBV, SGBV, this is a woman's issue and we should all care about it. So what I really wanted, I wanted to get on Women's Hour, which is this big kind of women's middle-class women, because once middle-class women get mobilized in the UK and they get angry, stuff happens. And I've seen it happen. I'm seeing it happening around Ukraine at the moment. The rather pathetic scheme we have in the UK is there because people got angry and they annoyed their politicians and they kept on at them. I think we have to reach out to all those organizations. We have to challenge the media about the things they say. So that's what we need to do. And as academics or humanitarians, what's our job? Our job is to tell people, to explain to people in an accessible way what is happening and why it's outrageous, and then gently suggest that they might want to do something about it.
Super, thank you very much. Sandra, I'm going to come to you because I think you've got some stuff to add, but I think I want you to also focus on the question of what do you do for people who don't have time to read the report or won't know about it? Like, what is that nice TikTok video that tells them what's in it? Or like the tweet that's going to tell them what they need to do and why? Yes, because somebody just told me that you can learn lots about Excel from TikTok dancing. So maybe there's a TikTok dance that needs to be done with an educational perspective on this.
Thank you thank you for helping me to focus. Yes. Well, first of all, none of us should be careless and hesitant to raise awareness about issues that we heard here. And we should be learning about survivors' stories and obviously within our own limitations, how much we can handle with safe boundaries, but we should be raising awareness about what's happening. Every one of us can put a silly post on Facebook or somewhere, which is not actually silly. It has meaning because it will be spreading awareness about the vulnerabilities and all the different dangers that people without legal protection, well, technically they are protected, but in reality, due to structural issues, they are not really protected. They are on their own, are undergoing. So in short answer, what individual can do, raise awareness, have your open eye, have your eyes open, your heart open, your ears, and do whatever you can to spread awareness. Challenge the policies, as Jenny was saying. I would like to highlight here one disconnect between the domestic and international policies. Like we have feminist gender policies. There's so many there's lots of commitments of northern governments to support women's empowerment and ending violence against women and girls in southern countries, whilst once they arrive from these countries to their countries, there's very little protection and commitment to support their interest and they support the healing. So this is shifting us from thinking about violence in conflict and violence in displacement to what happens across forced migrant journey upon arrival to countries of refuge. We are so good in fundraising money for what happens in conflict, yes, and then once these people come to our countries, it's much more difficult to support them because of so many invisible barriers, structural and all different levels of social ecology, if we like to call it like that. And one more point I wanted to make is about Ukraine. So I just came back from the borders. I wanted to observe protection concerns at the Medica border crossing and Korchova. I'm originally from Poland, so I thought this is my responsibility. I should at least do that. Yeah, in my free time, I went. And the structural issues, what it makes, what we can see now is just unbelievable because people without preparedness, without the preparedness of authorities and governments, people are now being handled with better and less care of individuals who are volunteers. Yes, there's a massive movement of kindness. Yes, wherever we look at neighboring countries. But this comes with a cost of increased risks of exploitation, safeguarding gaps arise of different kinds. What I witnessed was that drivers, for example, from across Europe, from Germany, Italy, France, Portugal, and Spain, arrive and collect migrants. They upon very light touch screening of the registration numbers, the IDs, and the driving license, they are being trusted to transport up to 40 people in a bus to be taken to Germany or to Italy without any vetting and any referral process from the national authorities or local authorities confirming the credibility of the drivers is very concerning. But I believe that within this huge issue, we can be this little, we can and make a little of the butterfly effect. But we could say, yeah, well, this is happening. What can we do as persons? I think even by reacting to challenging, asking questions to the authorities, trying to, well, obviously contribute to the emergency appeals and so on, but by different things that we can do as individuals, we will make a little, little disruption of to this huge structural injustice and violence that is happening. Never undermine the power of little action, as the butterfly effect done, I think, was in the stop it, so we can stop bit by bit our sphere of influence.
Thanks, Sandra. And we actually have a question from someone online. Shireen Dahan said, I would like to thank all these thoughts and the engaged work the report reflects. And I'd like to hear from the panel if you see any solutions that you would suggest within the economic capitalist system we live in. Should we not be linking these topics to deeply economic ones? So I'm going to throw that back, as well as if any of the panel has an answer to that or the previous questions. And then I'm also going to ask you all for like your one line of what you want people to walk away with before we go to the reception. Last thoughts as well. Anyone want to tackle the economic capitalist system? Oh, please tackle the previous ones, and then I'll let somebody reflect on the capitalist system.
Just on the question of what individuals can do at their level, I think that we tend to underestimate the effect of what each person can do, actually. And I would really like to highlight that in our work, in our day-to-day work, one of the main catalysts to empowering a lot of these refugee survivors, women, men, youth that we work with is interpersonal connections. And that's what they are mostly missing is in their destination countries. Is it's very difficult for a lot of people to create real lasting connections with other individuals. It seems very simple, but it's actually quite a huge task. And I think that someone at an average person, what they can do is maybe just reach out to another person that they see that comes from maybe it's their neighbor, maybe it's someone that they see in class or in school, or just reach out, get to know them, really create connections. I think that's where it all starts.
Thank you very much, Sweet. Economic, Emily, you look like you want to answer one of the questions, whichever it may be.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, just on this point, I think how people can engage, I think it's also important for all refugees and for all refugee women and girls. And I think this solidarity that we are seeing right now for Ukrainian refugees, I would really, also encourage all the public to show the same solidarity with refugees from all over the world, and engage with support local organizations who work with refugee women, support their advocacy. Then also, if you're looking at financial support, provide cash and not kind, particularly. No, maybe I will rephrase it more, in work in terms of support for survivors. I think that cash programs are really key for women at risk to decrease risks of gender-based violence, but then also, as we spoke about intimate partner violence, to offer a way out of abusive relationship to refugee women, and then not just then the cash assistance, but then also support, for example, to livelihood opportunities, job placement, traineeship programs, anything that help refugee risk or survivors, connect with the job market. It helps with Lebanon, where I was working on such a program with Syrian refugees, but survivors and women at risk. That being able to be placed or to get a job or even an internship was really helping in terms of rebuilding self-confidence, establishing network, as we were saying, solidarity and like supportive network with people from the host community, but also with other refugees. I'm not sure I really addressed the capitalist side. I spinned it in another way.
Maybe need to bring an economist onto the panel for that one. I'm going to try to wrap this up as well. So I'm going to give you all like one last thing to say. And if you want to address the capitalist question there, how do you tie it to economic ones? I was thinking that maybe your example of Oxfam's gender tax could be how we could also do it if you're looking at adding a tax so that there are services provided across the way. But I'll let you go for last thoughts for us, Lisa.
Well, on the capitals, no. I just wanted to say that in leading up to this, as we all had lunch and met up before this panel, we also, of course, discussed some different points within this discussion. For example, also what are the root causes, right, of this violence and of forced migration, and of course, poverty and inequality is there, and you can't kind of not deal with that or not address that. So obviously, I to that question, I would just like to say that I think it's about time that we start treating inequality and discrimination and exclusion with the same urgency that we're treating these missiles in Ukraine right now. We never have, and I think we need to do that because it's killing a lot of people. That's my take on that question. Other than that, I really think that we have to make sure we keep working to make this everyone's business. And that everyone feels, that they have something they can call out. You could call out someone being bullied. It's in the same cat. Like you call out what you can call out in your own everyday's lives. And that we need to stop working in these strange boxes, although funding requires us to very often. So that's about it.
Super. Thank you, Lisa. Emily, did you want to add anything last words?
So, no, I mean, in terms of supporting directly refugee women-led organization. They are the experts, and important, even if there are let's say limitation or challenges around registration of the organizations and so on, that donors engage anyway. In UNHCR, for example, we've established a pilot scheme provide funding directly to refugee women-led organization. It is possible. It's just forward and willingness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra.
I would just emphasize what the SEREDA project is calling is to develop trauma-sensitive, gender-sensitive, and forced migrant-sensitive approaches to sexual gender-based violence in humanitarian, asylum, and immigration systems. What it means is to recognize that people experience trauma across their journeys, and upon arrival to countries of refuge might be re-traumatized. So we need to develop new ways of working with forced migrants to ensure that their needs are protected, they are responded to. We also need to stop working in silos, the humanitarian, the asylum, the immigration. We need to integrate, bring new approaches that are inclusive, while
well, integrated, basically. That's what we are saying. And for that, we need to build capacity. We need to train people. We need to develop new trainings that are inclusive of forced migrant vulnerabilities and specific experiences that people suffer from across different refugee routes and different journeys, however we call it. And I really appreciate the question about economic inequalities. Obviously, this is one of the root causes, and we need to ensure that there is a more equal redistribution of wealth if we wanted to prevent many cases of later violence kills, and this is not, we need to emphasize that it is killing people, and we should treat it with the same urgency as rescuing people in ambulances. Yeah, I think we need to raise the importance of this. So microfinance programs could be useful to help women to be self-reliant. I will end here because I have no time.
We're a little bit over, but we started a little bit late. That's why I'm letting us go over. But we're wrapping up shortly. Savit, please.
I'd say that from our end, at least from organizations that are working directly with migrant and refugee women, I think that we have to continue to lower the tolerance of a lot of people to violence, because that is one of the major issues that we're dealing with, is that people don't even consider themselves as being in violent situations because their tolerance to violence has been heightened. So really raising awareness on the different types of violence and then trying to lower that tolerance. That's one of the main issues that we need to.
Jenny, please, last word.
I mean, in terms of capitalism, yes, it's a driver of inequality. We seem to be stuck with it. So maybe we should be looking at developing responsible capitalism models where actually the capitalists who go into, countries that are developing and set up factories and poison countryside and employ women at half the rate they employ men, putting the pressure on them, highlighting what they're doing, and maybe they could be an engine of change if they actually had gender-sensitive policies themselves and pursued. That is highly optimistic. But you have to dream. In terms of SEREDA, I think Sandra's done a great job highlighting, what it is we really want to do. But for me, I want to stress there's been a kind of a mainstreaming versus specializations kind of debate slightly going on in the room, and I just want to say I don't think it's either or. I think we need specialists to ensure that mainstreaming happens, and to once we are mainstream, to make sure that GBV don't just disappear, because that often is what happens when you mainstream. So we need those specialists out there to keep learning, to keep innovating, to keep advocating, to keep checking, and to keep monitoring. But we certainly need, I think, both.
Super. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and for really identifying a number of things that we can do based on the research from the SEREDA Project, but also based on your own experiences. I hope that has given lots of you sort of the initiative to now go and start doing things on your own, because as it, is very clearly come out from the research, it is a responsibility on all of our behalfs that we need to be really addressing the fact that GBV is being perpetrated throughout journeys and when they still arrive in countries of asylum and on countries of arrival. I think the fact that humanitarian organizations need to be able to be much more responsive to the journeys that are happening, having those mobile services, but also making sure that GBV is really prioritized in our programs. And I mean, that point about the missiles, Lisa, made me think if we even had just 0.01% of what defense budgets have, the amount of work that we could be doing to, help survivors survive in a better way, have access to the services they need. I mean, we could make a huge amount. So there you go, Amnesty. Ask for some of that defense money for GBV survivors, please. But I do think it is that prioritization or the lack thereof, not only by humanitarian organizations, but across governments, that we really need to be pushing. It's that governments are often prioritizing, as you said, what they think we want, which apparently is tons of money in defense, but maybe that's not what we all want. And we really need to be really focusing on individuals, but really bringing the communities together so that we're able to provide those interpersonal connections, like you mentioned, Savit, but I think also really identifying ways that we can work with cultural institutions. It made me think, like, what's UNESCO doing on this, for example? They have huge networks of cultural networks and scientific networks and whatnot. So it is, I think, also looking at some of those less usual players in the humanitarian field and really looking at those that are involved in different countries along the journey. I am not going to try to summarize everything that was said because you can all go read the SEREDA report. It is definitely live by now on the website. Just Google SEREDA Birmingham, SEREDA Birmingham, and then you'll get it. There might be another SEREDA. I don't. Okay, so SEREDA plus Birmingham, and you'll find the report. And this really, I think, is the beginning of trying to get the messages out there. So really counting on all of you to identify and take parts of the report forward and really do what you can. And that call to action that Frank spoke about is for all of us. So really important there. So thank you to our panelists. We do have a reception now, and it's also an opportunity to take a look at the really impressive artwork that Pen Mendoka did based on the survivors' stories. And there are some stories not only of the journeys that they faced and the trauma they faced, but also stories of hope and like solutions that have been found. So that side's also there. And you can see that artwork downstairs. What we're going to do is go out this door, past the front desk, down the stairs, and then we will have a short explanation of how you can see the artwork. Basically, you have to push a button, I think. But somebody will explain that. There's a screen, push a button to the right, and you can see the artwork. But there are also beverages. So we invite you to join us for that. Please just take all of your belongings with you. If you want to put any luggage or bags in a locker, there are lockers near the toilets, which are behind the concrete wall that you will see just when you walk outside. And finally, the live streaming will be on YouTube, the Red Cross Museum's YouTube channel next week, in case you feel like you've missed something and you want to go back and remember what were those recommendations that our great panel has provided for you. And I think, you also can visit the temporary exhibition To Heal a World, which is also the link here. That's just downstairs where the reception area is. But you can also ask the front desk for an audio guide if you want to see the permanent exhibition of the museum. So thank you for that, museum. I think that's everything. Have I forgotten anything? So huge thanks to the museum and IFRC and SEREDA Project for organizing all of this. Thank you to all of you for joining us and asking some excellent questions. You can ask them more questions when you go downstairs over a drink, unless Lisa runs away from you, and then maybe you won't. But really, please take the opportunity to appreciate the artwork and really find out some more about the project. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you. Drinks are that way.